Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ann in Depth. We're so happy to have you here. Today, we're going to be talking about long-term COVID or long-haul COVID, which is COVID symptoms that are experienced far after the person has started testing negative or far after they're supposed to. And we had Dr. Landless, who is our Health Ministries Director at the Church, with us today.
It was an excellent conversation. There was a lot of vulnerability in the conversation, so keep it to yourselves as you watch it. But we hope that this will be useful to you because chances are you know somebody who is experiencing these symptoms long term. Send it to
Yeah.
them, tag them. And of course, if you're struggling with any of this, send us a prayer request. We have a team that's willing to pray for you all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So as you subscribe to the channel, as you are part of our community here, we're willing to pray for you anytime.
Amen. Thank you so much. And we hope you enjoy the program. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ann in Depth. I'm here with Dr. Peter Landless, who's Director of Health Ministries for the Seventh-day Adventist World Church. And Sam will be joining us in a second, but Dr. Landless, welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's a joy to be with you as always.
I'm so glad you're here to talk to us. We've had several conversations throughout the past 2 years, 3 years almost, about COVID. And today we're going to be talking about long COVID, or as it's called, long haul COVID. It's a mouthful to say,
It is.
um, which is what we're finding people are experiencing, and that is the initial illness is gone and symptoms are lingering. But could you give us a little bit, as we jump into this conversation, could you give us a little bit more of what is considered long haul COVID, or what we'll be talking about?
Sure. Long haul COVID is as its name implies, and it was to me amazing as you brought into the introduction that this is the third year now that we are talking about COVID-19. We're right in the midst of that transition into the third year, and it's been around, and we are learning every day from this novel, interesting, and challenging disease. And what has been noticed from early days of the condition is that there are people who don't immediately get over all these symptoms that they had, and they will present in various ways. One of the most significant ones is ongoing fatigue, and other symptoms they may have, certain pains, aches, um, a term which, and I was giving this term some thought the other day, brain fog.
Mm,
Brain fog. It's a very descriptive term. When you're in a fog, when you get close enough to something, you see it. Sometimes you have to bump into it, then you know what you've done. But trying to remember things, trying to recall things, trying to get one's thoughts together, the fatigue, and then also some people have depression, which
yeah.
is very significant. So long haul COVID are symptoms related to the initial illness, which started out and was diagnosed and treated, and then individuals still don't feel well after weeks or months. And that is the categorization of long haul COVID. It is not something where there's a blood test you can do and you say, this is long haul COVID. We are still the scientists who are studying this are still trying to develop what kind of algorithm, what kind of testing, what kind of biomarkers, if you will. In other words, you do a blood test and you can say, well, here are the indicators. This is long haul COVID. It has to be done with careful history, detective work, and also you've got to think of it. I remember being trained by the excellent teachers. If you never think of a diagnosis, you'll never make it.
Mm,
So unless this is in our minds, if we are not geared to it, if we're not programmed towards it, if we don't think about it, and I'm going to just say one more thing, and then I'd like you to just take it from there and ask whatever we can possibly discuss. And that is that there needs to be a conscious understanding of it. Sometimes it's so easy to say, oh, well, this is mind over matter. I wish people would just get over it now. It's time to, there has become a recognition of this as a condition. It is not something which is imagined. It is not something which people are using just to milk the system, as it were. But it is a reality, and those who've had it, it's not even only those who had severe COVID. There's a significant number of cases, and studies were done in New York, which show that even the milder forms of COVID, what we would call milder physical forms, can go into long COVID. That's just a nutshell summary, and then we can tease out lots of things from that summary.
One of the things that I think people are finding so frustrating about COVID is the wide range, like you just touched on it. So we have people who experience mild symptoms, something akin to a cold, or even being asymptomatic. And then people who who end up passing away, or who have such severe infections that they have lung transplants or other organ transplants, kidney transplants, and that sort of thing. And it seems to me that long COVID is similar, that you have people who are still experiencing exhaustion, but that I'm reading now that this is something that impacts people's cardiac system. It impacts, or it might impact their cardio, I don't know if there's a difference, their lungs or their breathing. And so some of us might think, oh, you're just tired, you just had COVID, you're tired, you're just a little bit tired. And I think what's frustrating about this for people who are experiencing it is just the lack of understanding of what's going on and what it can do to their system. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the symptoms that you're seeing as a doctor, some of the things people are dealing with. Like when I say it impacts breathing or lungs, or I don't know, because I'm not struggling with it. I talked to you prior to this that my sister had COVID. She's still dealing a year later. She has aches and pains. She wouldn't say she's a long hauler. She just says, look, I'm achy still from COVID.
Yeah.
Is that long haul? What does it look like if I were to say that? How do we recognize that in a person?
Again, I go back to what I said. You got to think about it, and then you'll recognize it.
Yeah, that's the problem. You don't know, Sam. It's like you say you don't know. And welcome, Sam. Thank you for being here. You don't know that what is it? You don't know until what is it? It's on your wall. You don't know.
You don't get it. People don't get it until they get it, and not a moment sooner. Yeah, that's it. People only get it when they finally got it, and not a moment sooner than that. So I suppose lots of people are in that situation.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this has so much impact on our general approach to issues. For example, the fact that, number one, it presents often with a lot of fatigue. Now, one needs to remember, when one talks about long haul COVID, people are no longer infectious during this stage, unless they get a second infection with COVID, which is possible. But it's not that the infection is continuing, but it's the aftermath, the after effects. You see, it's a widely spread condition. It's not just, when I say just, it doesn't affect only the lungs. It affects the lungs, it affects the heart, affects the brain, it can affect the kidneys. It's a multi-system disease. And this is where it is so different. And when it's called the novel coronavirus, for a very good reason. Our bodies had never seen this virus before. And we are now looking, and we as society, as a medical fraternity, are seeing now a completely exploding way that this illness presents itself. I don't want to be dramatic, but it's one thing to get a bad cold or to even have severe flu, and people die from flu. So let's not forget that. Having said which, the multi-system damage, and it's also largely related to the fact that with the inflammatory process that takes place with the infection of COVID-19 in the body, that you get a lot of inflammatory chemicals going around the body and causing inflammatory changes. But at the same time, the body becomes more prothrombotic. What does that mean? The tendency to form clots, little clots, occurs more frequently. And what happens to the little clots? They go through to little capillaries, the smallest arterioles, where the arteries and the veins connect through a system called capillaries, and they sometimes get lodged there. If they get lodged in the brain, for example, they can cause damage to the brain. If they do that in the heart, it can cause damage to the heart. Of course, in the lungs, you've mentioned the issues of being as severe that it could cause complete lung failure with the need for a transplant. So it's the term, and it just says it so clearly, ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So what this disease does, it gets into the body and it causes havoc. Then, of course, when you look at the fact that it affects our emotions, it's affecting it through our brains. So one's emotions are affected, one's moods can be affected. People who have perhaps a tendency to be depressed get even more depressed. And often people who have no tendency to depression after COVID will experience this. So all of this together it does manifest as what could be referred to as emotional, psychological, cognitive, mood issues. But all of that fits into the spectrum of what we talk about broadly as mental health. All of those factors affect our mental health. And we are so quick to just say, oh, I just wish they'd get over it. I wish they would just think positively. Now, in order to bring the changes about, it's got to be one which is based on solid experience, and there are more and more studies being done. There's an excellent center in New York which is doing long COVID care, and they are studying this, and they are looking as to how they can best with occupational therapists, with physical therapists, with psychologists, with psychiatrists, with physiatrists, people who work on the physical body as well. All of these components need to be addressed. But what we need to recognize is it's a real issue. There was a condition called chronic fatigue syndrome when I was a resident. And I must tell you that there were many of us, and I have to admit I was one, who thought this has just got to be the dumping station of the diagnostically destitute. You can't make a diagnosis. And so you say, oh, yeah, it's chronic fatigue syndrome. And then more studies were done and more results came out and more understanding came. And it was a real syndrome. And I think we're seeing a carbon copy of that evolving with COVID-19 and long COVID.
Dr. Lance, I'm just so sure, Sam, you want to jump in a second. What I've noticed about people who are experiencing long haul COVID is almost they beat themselves up too. They say, it's been 2 weeks. I'm still tired and I just need to get stuff done. And it's been 2 weeks. I'm not like, what are people going to say? What are people going to think? Especially those who are experiencing extreme fatigue, and they're beating themselves up. They are ashamed of themselves that they're still feeling. And that leads to a lot of anger and the depression that you're talking about, because they want it to be over so quickly. And I'll be honest, I was talking to a friend of mine last night and I told her, I said, I am vaccinated, I'm boosted. I'm not afraid of I don't want COVID. Please understand me. I'm wearing my mask, I'm being careful. So I'm not asking for it. But what I'm more afraid of, honestly, if I'm being honest, is long haul COVID. That's what I'm more worried about, because I'm more worried about what it's going to look like when I'm testing negative, and I can't, I'm too tired to do anything, or if I'm, whatever else could go wrong. And I see that in people I talk to who are experiencing it, and it's just, the COVID wasn't that bad, or the COVID was, I could deal with. This is different. This is not ending. I still can't smell. I still can't taste. I still can barely get out of bed and walk down the hallway. Yeah. And there's no light, there's no hope, there's nothing at the end of the tunnel that I see, because I don't know how long it's going to last.
So, Dr. Landless, let me try my best to stumble in the darkness and of my own ignorance and
That shouldn't be difficult.
try to define, our body's reaction to it. And please correct me in all the ways I will inevitably go wrong in this process. So there is this virus that when it infects our bodies, we have an immune system that fights against it. And it knows there is something foreign that is dangerous. And some of us simply react and kill the virus, and you have no symptoms that come out of that, and you're done. That's one end. You don't even know you've had it. On the other hand, our bodies react with such intensity, and the virus, because of the inflammatory nature of what that means, because when our bodies are fighting something, that's the inflammation. It sends signals everywhere. It takes away the energy from our mitochondria, if I'm not mistaken, in a way that will force us to slow down. It says, it's a message to the body saying there is a war happening here. Stop focusing on playing soccer. I now need you in bed. You have no energy to do anything else. This is all that you're going to do. So our body's response seems to be part of that process of our suffering. Our symptoms are really symptoms of our bodies reacting in that particular way. I don't know how the lack of smell or taste fits into this, and maybe the virus just goes and destroys it. I'm not sure how that works at all. But is, to some degree, long COVID, our bodies continuing to react as if they are at war, even when they are no longer at war? How does that work?
That's exactly what it is, Sam. And when I said it's not difficult to stumble around in the darkness of ignorance, it's very easy for all of us to do that. That's exactly what we do. And that's what we're doing right now. We don't have enough information. But yes, it is the ongoing inflammatory process which takes place. It's either resultant from multiple microclots and microemboli, we call them, little clots that have shot around the body into the brain, particularly we're talking now, the actual damage the virus causes per se, which it would do in the lungs or in the nasal mucosae, the lining of the nose, to damage the sense of taste and of smell and taste. And
so that's the virus itself acting directly.
It's more direct, and it recovers in very many people. So
I did. I took a month, but eventually my symptoms were 2.5 days, and those. So let me tell you about my experience of COVID, because I think I think it's relevant to this conversation. So I came back from Europe last year, and our family started to get symptoms. First, the boys. I have 3 boys. And we realized that this could be flu symptoms and fever and tiredness and so on. I said, yeah, maybe this is it. But my wife and I had nothing. The next day, we went to get tested. The boys came back 2 days later, because it was a PCR test that took 48 hours. And the boys came back positive. My wife came back negative, but she started to get the symptoms. So I was pretty convinced that it was not an accurate result. Maybe it was too soon on her infection cycle. And I thought, let's do it again, but let's try the antigen test. And sure enough, at that point, it was positive for her, but I still had nothing. So now I'm the only one left out, which, you kind of feel, why? Is this going to come for me or not? Because by then, with 3 boys in the house, hugging and kissing, and, it's just impossible that this did not happen when we still didn't know. So there was no point isolating in the house. Anyway, Amy had symptoms of fatigue. She lost taste, she lost smell. But a couple of days later, my symptoms started. And I lost taste, I lost smell. I was extremely tired. That's the fatigue. And it's unbelievable how you cannot, you don't want to open your eyes. It is insane. Within 2.5 days, all of that was gone. It came and went, and it almost seemed miraculous that it went for me. My wife stayed in bed for about 10 days and eventually she emerged. Our taste and smell lasted about a month. Her fatigue, months. And I'm not even sure that it left completely. My long COVID, it's not really long because it was only about 3 months after the infection, was a lack of control over my emotions, especially anger. It was so odd to me. I would be doing something and I would explode in a way that my children have never seen me explode. And then you take stock of it and you go, okay, I've been shouting for 3 minutes. Why am I doing that? Certainly what happened does not warrant this. And it took a while for me to realize what was happening. And even then, I don't know what was happening. I'm just describing what could be. And that is the emotional roller coaster you mentioned for COVID. But as you said, if it's not in your mind, you're not going to diagnose that. It's just going to be stress. It's going to be everything else but this. But I don't see any other way, because within 3 months that was gone. I regained control of my emotions. It's as if, the part of my brain that controls your impulses are suddenly gone, and you find yourself a victim of your own emotions. It is terrible.
Yeah.
Now, we as a family, when we realized, we talked about it, and then it was much easier, because then, my children could identify what was happening, and then it wouldn't happen. And I was like, oh, I see. Okay, that's what's going on. And I would stop. So that was the mechanism for that process. But I have a friend that I think I infected her, and that I tell you, the feeling of you bringing that to somebody without knowing, the guilt that you go through is impossible to comprehend. And she it was rough for her. She had to go to the hospital and stay there for a while. You follow through that as well, Dr. Landless, and you feel like you are guilty. First, when you have COVID, you feel shame, which was very odd to me. It's like the whole world is infected. Why am I ashamed of this? It's like you failed and you don't want to tell anybody. And then eventually, when you realize, and thankfully most people don't realize who they infected, but I did, and there is a whole guilt for that. And then this person is the closest person I know that had long COVID with multiple symptoms that refused to go away. And there is always that prayer that, look, God, why don't you just take this away? Why doesn't this just end? And so if you could talk a little bit about all that I just mentioned, this process of, it's almost like a lottery. You don't know how your body will react to this thing. Mm-hmm. And as Jennifer was saying, the scary part is the long
yeah.
COVID.
You've described it so beautifully, but you've also described the solutions to an extent beautifully, because it takes recognition by the individual themselves, by the people around them, by the employer, because this is where all the pressures are brought to bear. And remember that all of this is taking place in the scenario of 2 years of pandemic, with lockdowns, isolation, death, dying, chaos, economic chaos, how it's affected individuals. And somebody in the Stony Brook Medicine, New York, working on the long COVID clinic, said empathy is essential in these settings. It's important to recognize that a lot of these patients present with a sense of grief or loss for their prior life.
Interesting.
Think about that. They present with a sense of loss or grief for losing their prior life. That's how serious it is. And I'm a cardiologist. I'm not a psychologist nor psychiatrist. I've been very blessed to pastor people, but I'm not a counselor. But I do recognize very, very clearly that this line that comes out of Stony Brook, this excellent comment by Dr. Barata, who says it's important to recognize that a lot of patients present with a sense of grief. And the way that this all happens, well, we're learning the physiological and the pathophysiology. That just means, how does the mechanism work of making people sick? Well, it can be through clots, it can be through the ongoing inflammatory process. It's primed by our genetics, and it's primed also by our hormonal status, whether you're a male or a female. And so all of those things come into bear. We don't have the time to cover all of that right now.
Mm.
But these are factors which come into it. But the depression, cases of acute psychosis, people who've never been psychotic before present with acute psychosis, hallucinations, other problems that are really, quote unquote, unexpected after a viral illness. So what you described is exactly what we're discussing now. And we focus on mental health because this is so an important component of what we're talking about. You talked about fatigue. You said, and your body telling you need to be in bed. Well, of course, there's a downside to being in bed. Of course, we need to rest. Of course, we need to take the appropriate recovery time. But when people spend too much time lying in bed, they then develop clots in their legs and they shoot a big embolus to their lung and they die. So you've got to have this balance. But also people need to realize, and we talk about the importance of rest and exercise and diet, but don't try and get back. And Sam, I know you a little bit. I'm not going to expose you on TV, but what I will know is that you're a very driven individual and you're thinking to yourself, I've got to get back to exercising. I've got to get back to doing 60,000 steps every half a day. And, and you...
Sam, you do 60,000 steps every half a day.
No, I'm
slight exaggeration there, but
yeah. He's told me a million times not to exaggerate. But
yeah.
but I know he's, we become competitive with ourselves, and we've got to prove something. We've got to get back to doing it. We've got to be ourselves. We are macho. We are strong. We're not going to be victims of this long COVID. That's for sissies. We need to listen to our bodies. Yeah. We need to take the time to heal. We need to take the time to recover, and we need to seek professional help. This business of sitting alone and saying, I've got to just pull myself towards myself. I've got to just pull myself together and get back to doing everything I need to do. Supervisors, employers also need to realize this is a real issue. Yeah. And the only way that you can help individuals with this situation is to get them to the professional help that will give them the best options. And in many, it's going to take months to get better. But until we recognize that, we're not going to help people solve the problem. Sam, I don't know if that's answered your point, but it really, you've emphasized and you've described it beautifully.
Yeah.
And we need to take cognizance. When we see ourselves that way, get the help.
I want to talk about something, Sam, that you said, and Dr. Landless, I'd love for you to chime in too. And that's the shame that, like you said, I felt ashamed that I got COVID. And I think that it's so important to talk about shame right now, because I was on the phone with a colleague and they said, I'm telling people I had COVID because I want to break the stigma. I'm not ashamed I got it. It happened. And I think that there is a pride, of saying, well, I didn't get COVID or whatever, but you don't know. I mean, some of us may have gotten COVID and we don't know because we never experienced symptoms. So we're going about our life thinking that we're fine, but we don't know. Or maybe we're just really blessed to be able to work at home full time and never go outside. There's so many different circumstances. And so I think one of the things we say is, not only are we ashamed of getting COVID, right? And we need to break that stigma because it's everywhere around us. But also then we're ashamed of still having symptoms. And so along with COVID, there's just a sense of shame constantly. I've talked about this before. My sister's a teacher. She got COVID and she's like, I just feel kind of stupid. This was before vaccines even. I'm like, why? You didn't do anything wrong, how are you to avoid this? Child didn't know, you didn't know, it happened, And I think that, I don't know if it's a destigmatizing is the right thing, or talking about it, or saying, you don't need to be ashamed. In fact, we need to break the cycle of shame, not only for getting it in the first place, but then for continuing to experience symptoms. I mean, we have healthy people who are experiencing long COVID or long haul COVID in ways that are beyond what people who are not. There's no rhyme or reason to some of this. I think stumbling around in the dark with, our eyes closed is the best way of describing it. But how do we break sort of the shame cycle that we're feeling? Because I think that's important to do.
I also think in the conversation of shame, we need to include a little bit of that grief that Dr. Landless was talking about. Because as Brené Brown put it in her research, shame is the experience of you not being enough. You're not beautiful enough, you're not smart enough, you're not good enough, you're not rich enough, you're not educated enough, etc. Then you feel shame and you close down and you're incapable of being vulnerable. Those that are shame dissipates when you experience true vulnerability. And that's her research. Now let's apply it to our situation here. You have tried your best in every way possible not to be infected. And suddenly you are infected. So that's the first part of the shame. You failed at some degree. But the problem comes when those long symptoms arrive. Let's take brain fog as one of them. Okay, so the established COVID symptom of brain fog. How do you explain brain fog? I used to think really quickly. Now it takes me forever to come up with a conclusion. Now think about this. The things that are possible that defined your value before, now you don't have that anymore. There are two things that happen: the grief process and the shame process. I'm not enough without this thing. So if you had this all your life, let's take intelligence, for example. You had great intelligence all your life, and that's your identity. You were very clever. You were very smart. You could figure things out. And then long COVID comes, and not only during those weeks where you were infected, but 3, 4, 5, 6 months later, you still struggle to focus on a meeting to understand what people are actually saying. Suddenly, your identity as the person who understands and is able to simplify and lead is gone. So now, where does your value come from? Is it because you were created by God and redeemed by Him, or is it from performance? So that's a serious, indictment on how our society lives and operates. And this is why we need to always remember that our value does not come from performance, whether you are able or disabled. In any particular way, your value is there because you bear the image of the divine. And whether you are capable now as you were before, or you are now incapable when you was capable to do something, it doesn't matter. That's not where your value comes from. Now you just need to slow down because that's what your body has. If you break a leg and your job involves running relays, you will do it more slowly. So this is in the physical sense. And in the mental sense, for those of us that work with information all day long, just have patience with yourself. For me, it was the lack of control. I always had control in my life. Now I don't. How can I function? How can I be myself, my sense of identity, and so on? So it's the shame for having gotten COVID, and it's the shame for the symptoms that you can't shake away. Is this the new me? Is this how I'm going to be for the rest of my life? That grief of losing a limb or losing a part of your body that you once had, and there's lots of literature on that. And I think that is part of the equation, is it not, Dr. Landless?
Absolutely. And again, you both have summarized this very well. In fact, not only summarized, but described it so well. These are the things we go through. I've caught myself saying, somebody said, well, how's the family? They're all well. One was not well. It wasn't COVID. Have you said that? Have you heard people say that?
Yeah.
It wasn't COVID. And then what happened? I better check in and get permission on this one, but shortly after directly after the Christmas vacation, one of our family members returned home, and within 2 days, works in a hospital, started to say, just let me know and say, I've got a terribly sore throat. fully vaccinated, boosted, etc. And there you go. That's what it is. And of course, I had just read an article which said that younger female health professionals are more at risk for long-haul COVID.
Yeah, I just read that.
Wow.
And so this is the first thing that goes into the mind of the clinician. Yeah. So here are the things which, and then you talk about shame. Well, did you wash your hands? Of course they washed their hands. Were you vaccinated? Yeah, no, sure, vaccinated. You didn't talk to strangers, and so it goes. The testing and tracing showed it was a patient contact in a clinical setting. Having said which, there is not a shame to getting COVID-19. We need to have that very clear in our minds. And just as much as it's not a shame if you get long COVID, you see, this is where we do need to understand grace. We need to understand God's love. We need to understand his enormous caring for us, that even when we go through these issues, and what my default position is that even when I go through the fog of COVID-19, or even if it be Alzheimer's one day, or the terminal stages of a ravaging cancer, he has promised, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.
Praise him.
We don't have to prove ourselves, but we are living in a world where people expect and demand that we prove ourselves all the time. And we don't do self-care to work harder. If we don't do self-care, we cannot work adequately. So there's an important role change which needs to take place, or not only role, prioritization which needs to take place, is the time to heal and get better. The destigmatization of COVID, you see, has also been very, very sadly amplified and exaggerated by the polarization which has taken place over the COVID-19 vaccines and all the situations surrounding that whole scenario. And it's caused people to, and also it's been polarization not only into the prevention through vaccines or hand washing or masking. Forget the vaccine. Talk about the simple public health issues. If you seem to be wearing a mask in some settings, it's because you belong to a certain political party. What absolute nonsense. If you want to do something which is going to be preventive for yourself and for others, you follow public health protocols. But all of this has been wrenched out of perspective, and now it's all brought into the individual who is now trying to get over, as you've described so well, this sense of grief from a loss of their former life and feeling guilty about it. And this is where we have to cast ourselves at the foot of the Lord, at the feet of Jesus, plead for his healing, but also know that in the process, even the Apostle Paul, we don't know what his condition was, and it probably wasn't long-haul COVID because his brain was pretty well preserved, but he pled for it to be removed 3 times. My grace is sufficient for you. And that's, I can imagine a viewer right now saying, that's easy for you because you're not sitting in the clutches of long-haul COVID yourself. Each one of us faces a trial, a difficulty, an issue, a relationship. Maybe it's the grief of the loss of our former self. But we are not alone. And as we go through this crisis, as we continue, because people say, we're nearly at the end of COVID. I hate to be a prophet of doom, but we're not at the end of COVID. I'm not talking about hospitals bulging at the seams and health systems teetering under the pressure of COVID-19 admissions. I'm talking about the long-haul COVID. I'm talking about the the disabilities that are coming through it, the increase in addictions, the loss of people to suicide through what has been going on over the last 2 years and the results of what has been happening, the readjustment of families, of work situations, of relationships which have been shattered and lost. We're in for a long haul related to COVID, all of us.
Let
But
me.
We don't know the cost yet.
And for those who are suffering, we need to be empathetic, sympathetic, and we need to be there for them.
Let me bring in the long effects of COVID for those that were not infected or may not have been infected. You know, as you read the passage about the grief of a life that was lost, looking to the past, there is also the grief of the life that never happened. So I'm thinking of teenagers especially. They're grieving graduation issues, they're grieving trips, and these are first world problems. But there are also, you know, some severe problems in the lack of friendships that could have been developed, and the negative impact of COVID, unrelated to the individual's inflammation, the individual's infection, but related to how the world changed when there was a particularly important moment for your life and your career. Those that were about to get married or were potentially going to get married and may not be anymore. Those that were the graduation elements, and maybe a new career, new job, maybe a potential move to another part of the country or the world as a job opportunity, and so on. So that's another element of grief for a future imagined that did not materialize. So that's another element there.
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the something that was brought up to me yesterday is somebody said that when they had COVID, the first week everybody was so compassionate, and then as the long haul COVID kept going, people became less compassionate. And I was talking to my friend about this. I was like, everybody, and this isn't to put, look, I say I haven't experienced symptoms because, like I said, I don't know if I ever had COVID and just was asymptomatic. I haven't yet experienced, Sam, what you have talked about, because for whatever reason. So but to say that I'm coming out of COVID unscathed, it would be a lie, because we've lost millions of people in the world. We've lost almost 1 million people here in the US. We've lost family members and friends, and we have people in our lives who are experiencing, Sam, like you were saying, long haul COVID. We have missed trips, and we have missed seeing our friends. We've missed weddings. We've missed relationships. We've missed all these things. And I wonder if some of it is, it's not that I'm not compassionate to what you're going through. It's just, I'm barely at this moment in time getting through my day on my, and I'm not specifically talking about me, I'm talking about all of us. We're barely getting through our days on our own. The idea that, you know, you said that we're hoping that COVID is soon, hopefully, God willing, passing from a pandemic to an epidemic, right? That this is some endemic. What? Yes, I'm not a doctor, but I don't know words. You'd think I'd know words because I am a communicator, but so we're hoping that this is moving into a new stage, and that life is going to go back to some semblance of what it was. That doesn't mean that we haven't all experienced such severe loss, that we haven't experienced just an unimaginable, like, Sam, when we think about, remember where we were right before COVID hit. Dr. Landless, you with us, or we were in Indianapolis. You know, we were at a gala. We were planning for the future. We were so excited, and then that was 3 years ago.
And 2 days later, everything changed.
Yeah. So I think, like, how do we feel like, I want to feel compassion for my friends, continued compassion for my friends who are experiencing long haul COVID. But I think a lot of us are just like, I can't even get my mind around my day, because I'm also concerned about my mom. I'm also concerned who might get COVID. I'm also concerned about my sister, or I'm concerned about my friend next door, or I'm worried about the numerous friends who are sick, or the grandparents we've lost. And so it's just, it's almost like too much compassion and empathy. I don't have it in me.
As you are describing this, Jennifer, I somehow my mind went to the loss that is unmeasurable. The people that died,
Yeah.
they were serving different parts of the world in different ways. They were serving either in general services, electricians and the like, people that help our lives to function. They were serving in, there were doctors and teachers and health professionals, people that help us heal. They were serving in, lawyers, politicians, people that help us negotiate with the world. They were serving as pastors and priests and community leaders, people that help us connect with God and each other, for that matter. They were serving in technological capacities. They were dedicating their lives to creating tools that make our life better. And now they're not here anymore. How many things will not be done because they're not here anymore? How many ways are we going to lose service? And when I say service, I mean the ability to alleviate suffering in our own lives, because that's what it means. And if you ever wondered how the person who works for your electrical company is helping you to alleviate suffering, just turn off the electricity for a week in winter. You will figure out very quickly how much suffering comes when the people who have jobs and get up in the morning and go fix things, when they stop fixing things, you notice and you suffer, because this whole infrastructure is a miracle. Some of us complain a lot when the internet goes off, but the internet is like the top layer in a big layer of logistics are disrupted around the world. You have food chains that are disrupted. You have the increase in prices, all of the money that we printed. Don't think for a second inflation isn't coming for us. It's here. Fuel is more than twice the price than when I moved to America 6 years ago. All of this is the impact of a event that changed our lives for the foreseeable future. What does that mean? It means that each of us will need to pick up more responsibility than we had before, because you don't have, how, I don't know what the numbers are recently on how many people died, but what is it like now, Dr. Landless?
It's total in the world. It's between 5.5 and 6 million.
Yeah.
So that's 5.5 and 6.
Million.
Yeah, million.
Oh, 5,500 and a million.
No. 5.5 million around the world.
Between 5.5 and 6 million.
You don't lose 5 million people and continue business as normal.
Yeah. And those are the documented. I mean, how many people have died of COVID that we didn't know about? Sorry, go ahead.
So this new generation, not only don't they have the things that they wish they had, all of us would need to look at the world very carefully and assume responsibility for the things that our loved ones were doing to some degree. And it requires, of course, there's a spiritual element to this, but if you can, it's not just the compassion. If you're at home and you watch this video and you feel a sense of, compassion for somebody, that's only one element of it. But you need to get up and do something for others that are not just feeling bad for them. And that's the action. That's taking responsibility for tangible things. And this is the demand. If Jesus doesn't come in the next 20 years, which I hope he does, please, a new generation will need to take the responsibility of those 5 million and more, because it keeps counting, that are no longer serving, no longer alleviating the suffering of others in the way that they had.
Matthew 9:35 says, and Jesus went through all the villages and healing, preaching. And when he saw the people, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. This is what you've described, Sam, that this is what people are feeling like. And you described the services component of it. What about the parents which have been removed from the scene, the children who are out of the picture now, the loved ones? people who've died in isolation, never being able to say goodbye. So we've got to bring all of that into the equation to really realize the extent of what has happened in this world. And that's why that one line that says empathy is essential because of the grief people go through. It's the grief that's in our microcosm of our own personal world, of our family world, of our community world, and of the world in general. And we each need to step up to see what can I do to make the difference. But I would urge that as we do that, we also prioritize what can I do to keep me in a state to continue to make the difference. That's spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically. So that means having good nutrition, doing the exercise, getting the sleep, having the social support, communion with God, dependence on Him, prayer, trust. All of it comes together. This is where the health message, and forgive me, you can't take health out of this component right now,
No.
but the health message is a multifaceted gem that God has given to us and said, take it, run with it, live it, but you won't live it until you believe it. And when you believe it and you practice it and live it, then you can preach it, and then you can share it. And this is where we are. And that covers so much. But what you said is it's going to behove each one of us to be there to make the difference. And that's what He's called us to do.
And I would also say that, sorry, I would just say too, when you're talking about that, is if you're feeling some of the things that we talked about, to find someone to talk to, not just a friend, but like find a doctor to talk to. I mean, if you're feeling physically ill, go see a doctor and you're concerned about long COVID, but also if you're feeling sad or like overwhelmed, or find a mental health professional to talk to, or pastor or somebody, because friends are not.
Don't be scared to use the C word, the counselor.
Yeah, counselor. Well, I was going to say friends are not counselors. Some friends are counselors if that's their job, but they shouldn't be a counselor. Yes, a professional counselor.
See a professional.
Right. I think it's so important, especially like, I don't want it to seem like, there are people who are struggling with long haul COVID. They're struggling in ways that I can't imagine. But I think for me, we're all still dealing with trauma. Go talk to a counselor so you can be there better for your friends who are struggling with long haul COVID, so you can love them better, so that you can be compassionate and empathetic towards them.
Dr. Landless, I'm going to switch gears if you don't mind, because the Adventist Church has hundreds of hospitals and clinics around the world. And you are the health ministries director for the World Church. So I would like to have you talk to our doctors and our medical professionals at this time in this particular way. There is tremendous pressure on doctors and scientists to have answers to something that there aren't that many answers for. We're still debating whether eggs are good for you or not. And there have been hundreds of research that has been going on for decades, and tomatoes as well, for that matter. Now, all of a sudden, there's a new novel virus. We haven't seen this particular virus before, but we look to doctors and scientists and give us all the answers, because you know the answers, don't you? No, there is a long process of learning and making mistakes and fixing those mistakes and finding new research and moving forward in the best way possible. That's the point. But the pressure is there. And I think doctors generally suffer from a messiah complex of trying to fix the world and fix everybody else. That seems to be what others believe about doctors. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But there is this sense of, doctors have this, are more prone to a messiah complex, maybe pastors too. And this makes it worse, because now people are looking at them, not just the world in general, for answers. Individuals are going to them and going, doctor, what can I do to save my wife? What can I do to get rid of this long COVID from my life. And the truth is, we don't have much research on long COVID because we are right now experiencing it for the first time. There could have been no other studies. And you mentioned a couple of studies that are being done. And as the data comes in, we'll have better insight into how to help and so on. But what would you say to doctors that are feeling the pressure to have answers that literally don't exist yet?
You really ask the most wonderful questions. I could tackle a whole lot of things, but I know the time doesn't permit it. Do physicians and healthcare providers feel that they are the answer to everybody's prayer? Well, I wish we were, and we should try and always remember that we are there to be God's hands, heart, and outreach, touching lives. Do we get frustrated when we deal with patients and situations which are difficult to understand, difficult to treat? It's all well and good. One of the things I experienced as a cardiologist is that when the patient came in and you were able to open up that coronary artery and the angina, the chest pain went away, the blood flowed immediately well, and then the patient within a day is up and running around, or at least walking around, and you've got a quick fix. But it's when you're sitting with the long issues, those which are difficult to deal with, that's where we need to support our health professionals very clearly, and where health professionals need to stand back and not forget the basics of our art and our calling. And that is, number one, to do no harm. And when we do no harm, we ourselves need to be in a condition where we are not inflicting harm because we're too tired to think, too tired to make good decisions, exhausted, and never refreshing or renewing. So that's one component of it. The second thing is, do not take shortcuts. One of the things I've noticed in COVID-19, and I'm not in day-to-day clinical practice, but I talk to many, many patients, and there's a tendency for people who've been through significant COVID never to have an interaction with a healthcare provider face-to-face or mask-to-mask. So it's all been done on screen and through a test. And, well, this is what you got COVID, and get a pulse oximeter, watch that, and continue with that. And then people feel, well, I'm not getting better. And, well, you've had COVID after all. We as healthcare providers need to remain engaged and see patients. Now, I understand waiting lists are long, waiting rooms are full, you've got social distancing in waiting rooms, services are overstretched. What would be my message to be? Don't take the shortcuts. If someone continues to be ill, make a diagnosis. Okay, it was COVID. Is this long COVID? Is this a physical? Is this emotional? Is it related to whatever we've talked about? Make the diagnosis and then make the referral. But also to be there, to be empathetic, to listen, and to care. And yes, we are anxious, and we have seen in 2 years progress on vaccine development, and of medication development, of trials which are being done, of examinations and testing. Mistakes have been made, conclusions have been drawn, and those have been rephrased and reworded. But we're in a learning curve, a steep learning curve. And for physicians to remember, for healthcare workers, for nurses, physical therapists, occupational therapists, allied health, respiratory therapists, everyone to remember, we are part of a team. And our privilege and our joy is to be there to escort our patients, to accompany them, to encourage them, and to be fueled by the understanding of God's calling for us to the sacred trust of giving what we can in a broken world, in a situation we don't fully understand, but one where being there makes all the difference. You can be the most clever doctor in the world. You can be the most qualified physician in the world, but you've got to be affable you've got to be available. And the way that my experience has taught me, you've got to be dependent on the source of power who will use you to do things over and above that we ever dream or ask.
Amen. I know we need to wrap this up. And you just said something so beautiful. So I was wondering, I think, Dr. Landless, I think we can wrap it up if you are willing, and if you could just pray for us.
Sure. No, it would be a privilege to do that. And I just want to thank you for creating this forum. You know, it may be thought that we're being very theoretical. We're not. What has come out on this program has come from the heart, each one's heart. And to the hearts of those, the health professionals, the care workers, those who push the gurneys, those who provide the food, those who are doing all this work to make the difference. And it's a privilege to pray for each and every one. Father, you have been present in our conversation. And Lord, your heart breaks and when you see what is going on in this world. And we pray that our hearts will break as yours does, because that will motivate us to be the church you've asked us to be, to care, to love, to empathize, mingle, attend to needs, and to point to Jesus, who is the solution. And Father, whether we live through the pandemic or we don't make it through the pandemic, we ask that whatever takes place, you will keep our eyes focused upon you and our faith firmly trusting you, because you are faithful. And Lord, I pray for everyone who's been infected, everyone who's been affected, everyone who has cared, everyone who continues to treat, to help, to rehabilitate. And Father, the families of those who have sacrificed their family members, who have died in the caring of people, for people, health professionals who have died at the coalface of medicine. Father, bless those families. Take care of them. And we would commit each one to you. And we ask, Father, that as this past 2 years, which has in some ways just rushed by, in other ways has lingered far too long, help us to remain homesick for heaven, where there will be no more death, dying, sickness, or suffering, where the handkerchief of revelation wipes forever away the tears of Genesis, and you take your children home, healed, restored, transformed by the great physician, the Savior, the one who gave all that we could spend eternity with you. Be with us to that end, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Landless. Thank you so much for this conversation. I hope that people find some hope in it. And Sam, thank you for coming on and sharing your story. It was so helpful. And for those who are watching, if you have a question, if you have something you want us to pray for us, if you're experiencing, pray for you, if you're experiencing long haul COVID, or if you know someone who is and you need prayer, let us know. We're here to pray for you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we'll see you next time. God bless.
God bless you.